Okay. The humanitarian OpenStreetMap has a unique position partnering with the national government with some of your projects in the past. So di masa lalu, in terms of services or in related to disaster and closer to my research, early warning system.
Yeah.
So what have you been doing in the past in Indonesia?
So we already active in Indonesia since start in 2011, and our main focus is more on the data collection, especially for basic infrastructure such as road and building all over Indonesia. Because in understanding the impact of a hazard, we need to understand like how many assets will be affected. It can be like buildings and roads. Because in terms of people or like population, it's quite up-to-date data. I mean, you can easily get it like from the civil registry, because every time there is death or birth in the family, you need to get the birth certificate or death certificate.
Yes.
So usually that kind of data is already widely available. What we see as a gap is more understanding like where our population distribution, like where people live. I mean, if we say that one area or one village is flood prone, how can we say that which area of that village is flood prone? Because it's rarely that the entire village is flood prone, usually only like part of it. Especially if we also talk about a very localized hazard such as landslide, usually it's like the area of impact of possible impact is around like one or two sub village. Because it's quite localized, and it really depends on the contour and the type of soil, weather, and there are so many factors that contribute to hazard or like disaster prone. Or the proneness of disaster of an area. So our organization is focused mostly in helping communities, local BPBDs and also BNPB in like how to use open geospatial data. We use the data mainly for disaster preparedness or mitigation, so we understand where people live. We also work with the local partners such as Indonesian Red Cross, LPBINU, and then Church World Service in like for risk assessment, like in an area, so that we understand like so what types of hazard exist in an area, and then how many people potentially be affected, and like what's the contingency plan towards that. So our organization is focused in mapping and also implementing geospatial analysis about a place, and so like we understanding what's the potential, what's the challenge, and what kind of perceived risk in the area that we need to be aware of.
So one of the first components of a multi-hazard early warning system or people-centered is about understanding the risk. And there is like the various levels or scales. There's the national government, provincial district government, and then there's the community. Based on your work in the last couple of years, can you like give a description about the level of their understanding of the risk in their area? How is it like in the different levels?
I think in the past decade, national level goes really well. I mean, they've already developed like INA risk, that is to assess the or like they have the IRBI, Indonesian Index Risiko Bencana Indonesia, Indonesian Disaster Risk Index, that basically already give like a broad overview about what's the condition in our country. But what's still being a challenge when we deliver our project or program throughout Indonesia is that usually like goes down from national to province. Provincial level also have good resources. I may say good resources is not necessarily, because some provinces can be really excellent in having the system, having the methodology and disaster management.
Can you state what province has a excellent?
Well, one of the good example is Central Java, for example, because Central Java even already have their own like LIDI, Layanan Inklusi Disabilitas, which is basically like disability inclusion. They want for the disabled communities to also actively involve for disaster management and mitigation. Because also the disabled community doesn't want to be just a victim. They want to be actively preventing, actively aware about what's happened during disaster and how they can contribute as well. Not necessarily they just being a victim that needs to be assisted. So Even like in some district in Central Java, they also already have a good capacity or resources dealing with the disaster, but we also see that some others may not have adequate resources. And goes further from Java, we see
What
that there
about
is still
Bali?
a
What
gap.
about Bali?
Bali also have like, I think it's a good example in like they're already aware about the potential, like the volcano there, and then other types. I mean, if I remember correctly, Bali is also like one of the good example that have been trained and have resources in terms of like emergency command center. They already have AOC, emergency operation center, and I think that's also donated by I forgot which donor. I think French Red Cross or like I think American Red Cross. Or sorry, PDC, the Pacific Disaster Center, also supporting the implementation of INAWARE as to be used in the command center so that they can monitor and
in the Bali.
In a Bali province. So yeah.
And I think so that further east, what happens further east?
Well, further east we see that more growing gap on the resources, especially in terms of personnel. I mean, not necessarily people aware about that there is technology, but even the basic infrastructure is not there. Not yet there about in terms of like computer software or like hardware. They're not necessarily don't have the budget or like resources that can manage a good command center, for example, during disaster. Most of the emergency response still done conventionally. They're not really, they don't have like resources or people who have adequate capacity in disaster management. So I still see that there are still gaps that we need. And I mean, even like the role of NGO or organization is really important in like closing the gap between what's on the eastern part of Indonesia and what we have in Java, for example.
So like the two latest disaster which have headline was in Palu and in Lombok. So how do you think that they coped or their capacity in responding to it or in preparing for that disaster?
Yeah, I think
understanding the risk of that.
Yeah, initially Palu. Initially it was Lombok first, and I saw that Indonesian Red Cross is really like playing an active role there. Especially they already have like a growing or like a strong network on the ground, so they're aware about what happens. But it is also from what my discussion with my colleague in disaster management, like when Palu earthquake happened, then suddenly most of the focus is also shifted to Palu. So people kind of forgetting Lombok, and then some meetings and some supports still trying to be given by several local organizations, but it's still not really as focused as initially when Palu earthquake haven't happened yet. So and with Palu itself, I saw that there are already like a local organization that actually active, but then again their resources is also greatly diminished by the disaster, so it's hard for them to also play an active role in that emergency response. So we kind of relying on local organization, and I think this is also one of the example that I saw on how government also try to use their own resources rather than not relying on international support, which in some way it's a good way of having an independent, also have internal capacity to respond to disaster without too much relying on external resources. But this is also like the first step when sometimes organization and community did not prepare to be independently manage that themselves.
Okay. Interesting. Well, previously you said that these maps that you create, you partner with other organizations, you use it in a planning process. And in Indonesia, we know that there's various planning processes. You have the midterm, you have the annual, and then you said that there was a contingency planning. So probably can you explain that in more detail, in which areas you support in the planning process?
So we always coordinate with the national level and provincial or district level disaster management agency about the prone areas. Like even our government already decide, the BNPB and Bappenas already have like 136 priority district, meaning that the district is already like part of the RPJMN or like the mid planning, and not only because they're disaster prone, but also because they're like economy hub, meaning that if there is a disaster happen in the area, it will also greatly impact the economic growth in the area.
So basically the criteria to be a priority is that it's disaster prone plus,
and I think it's also economy hub. Yeah, that's what I understand from the RPJMN on this 136 priority district or city all over Indonesia.
Is it the one that ends this year or the one that will continue for the next 5 years also?
It was I forgot which one of which year. I mean, because the targeted area is expected to be finished, map all of them by the end of last year even. But then it's, I mean, because some of them is still not being completely mapped, or there is still like importance of completely map this area, then I think some of them is being carried forward this year, as well as possibly next year as well.
So basically, for the next our 5-year planning, disaster is already included. Disaster-prone areas are included in the planning process.
Yeah, and Bappenas is already aware and working with BNPB in like deciding which. I think like the IRBI is also one of the indicator for that, or the use of INARIS information is also part of the inputs on how we determine that an area is a targeted area that we need to focus on.
What about the capacity of Bapeda at the local level in their planning process and the disaster process?
We're not really working with Bapeda closely. Our partners is usually like local organizations or BPBDs. But as far as we know, in the past we also working with Bapeda, especially in trying to acquire the geospatial data for an area, because usually, as we know that in the national level there is a Geospatial Information Agency or BIG, which they're the one who lead all the mapping effort for our country. But then because they're national institution, not necessarily they have the capacity in each province or in each district. So usually this rely on local office such as Bapeda, who's usually where people try to get geospatial data for that district or city, then they will head to the city or district Bapeda. In provincial level. But then in our experience, even like different Bapeda may have different data availability, and also like the format is not necessarily what uniform or like ready to use. Like there are cases where we go to Bapeda and we try to get the road map or like the building map for an area, and they only have like PDF. Or in some other province they only have the JPEG or like the image, because they say that this is what's given by the third party. I mean, they give it as a tender to a vendor, and then that's the end result that they got. Probably there's also like other raw data like shapefile, GeoJSON, or like something that is more ready to be processed or analyzed. But not necessarily that Bapeda have the resources to understand that they need to also have this data as part of the deliverables or as part of the outputs of the project.
And about the contingency planning, so what's the process for the contingency planning, and what type of hazards that you usually dealt with for the contingency plans?
So we are heavily involved in the contingency plan because when we are funded by AUS-8 or DFAT from 2011 up until 2018, at that time we are deliver training on how to develop contingency planning using INASIF. INASIF is a software that is co-developed between Australian government and Indonesian government. That is to understand, to estimate an impact of disaster in an area if it happened. Like, so for example, if we have the hazard layer of flood, like we know where are area affected by floods, and then we also know that in that area there is this many building and how many roads and people or population, then we can estimate like what the impact of disaster looks like. So based on this, people can develop a good contingency plan, because without like scientific estimation, then you can only have like guess, and people guess is far from accurate because
yeah.
not necessarily they're involved or understand of recent disaster. It's not necessarily they also remember like what step that needs to be taken during disaster. So this kind of tool is actually assisting local disaster management agency to at least understand that this is the estimated impact. So based on that, they can have like planning on like how many logistic needs to be prepared, how many kilogram of rice, how many liter of water needs to be prepared in case of certain type of disaster happen.
In how many locations that you make the contingency plans, or you with?
We train more than 15 provinces all over Indonesia, if I remember correctly. I can give you also the exact number.
Yeah. And also, is it just district level or just province level that you do?
It's provincial and down to district or city level. Like we have help local government develop their contingency plan, like in Makassar for floods, and then in Ambon for earthquake, and then in Padang also for earthquake. So there are several city or district that we've collaborated with, supported by the BNPB and also by the disaster management innovation that is part under the DFAT or Australian Embassy, who actually have a program targeting in that area.
Okay. So what's interesting in the development of early warning system? So in the start, it started with the forecast-based early warning system, and then it moved to the impact-based early warning system. So they really try to find what is not just that a weather event is going to occur or a certain event is going to occur, but they also want to have impact. And then finally, the development is that for early warning system, it's trying to be more of a risk-based. Does your work with generating maps and try to identify the impact correlate or connect with early warning system established by the national government or local government?
Well, for some hazard, yes. Like one good example is earthquake. Like when we receive earthquake information from BMKG, for example, and then the INASIF is also integrated in BNPB, so that it can automatically generate estimation of that earthquake impact, either to population and also like how many buildings in thousand may be affected by that particular earthquake based on the magnitude information from BMKG. So that's already implemented, but for other type of hazard it's quite difficult to do that. I mean, other type of hazard that is possible we generate the estimation of impact is for like for volcano. Because the PVMBG they already have like kawasan risiko bencana (KRB) for each of volcano in Indonesia. So then we can produce an estimation of how many people, how many buildings may be affected. Again, this will really depends on the completeness of geospatial data in that area. I mean, if an area not well mapped, then the result can be not accurate because we haven't mapped the whole building in that area. So it can be like, oh, it's very low number, but that's caused not because there is a low number of building, but because it's only like low number of building have been mapped in that area. So it's also important to understand like not only the population but also like where these people live, whether these people live at the KRB area, in the high risk area, the red zone, which is basically needs to be evacuated during volcanic eruption, and also like which one is on the yellow or which one is on the green. That is basically it's quite safe, but potentially we can designate like IDP camp in that area.
Okay, so it's safe to say that for impact-based early warning system, it's still focused on just single hazard, and the single hazard is just mainly for earthquake and for volcano eruption, where impact-based early warning system is implemented, is kinda implemented.
Yeah, and I think it's also kind of depends as well. Like when there's big earthquake just happened, then suddenly all people will really pay attention to earthquake. But sometimes people also neglect or like didn't have enough focus for regularly occurring disasters such as flood or like drought, for example. So I think it's also important because this recurring disaster may also having impact to the poor population in the area because they cannot cope if flood happen every year. Then there will be like significant fund needs to be allocated for that disaster. And for the poor, I think this is also can detrimental for them as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
The time you're working with generating the maps and cooperating with the local government, do you ever try to meet up with from the private sector, like companies, probably the tourism sector, like the hotels, probably in Bali, or any other private sector that probably might find it useful to use disaster maps, not from the government but also from NGOs?
So far I think like our past collaboration is with Grab, like Grab understand about they have an army of driver that it's possible to be deployed during disaster as well to help the emergency response, like what happened in Gunung Agung eruption a couple of years ago. I mean, we collaborated with Grab. We teach the Grab driver on how to use a simple apps to collect data on the ground.
And what apps did you guys use?
We're using ODK Collect.
Yes.
ODK Collect and then combined with the Kobo server by BNPB. So so the data is all went into BNPB server. So we teach them on how to use ODK Collect, and we try to use as many as drop downs answer rather than something that they need to type, because it will reduce error, and they find it really easy to use as well. And we've collected location and information, I think more than 70 IDP camp throughout or surrounding the Mount Agung volcano.
And that's for how long was that?
I think for it's we done that for like a week or two, I think, because that's still a pilot, and we need to understand whether it is helping or assisting, and how it can also give impact to the disaster response in Bali. But I think it went really positive, and even like there is I heard that Grab and BNPB is going to have an MOU so that they can have like legalize this kind of cooperation. So hopefully it can be also implemented for the future crisis as well.
Utilizing the what do you call it, the online services. Because
I mean the Grab driver are already quite familiar with the use of smartphone. So an apps with the simple to use Indonesian interface will be helpful as well.
And does your work also, because you must work within networks with various organizations, how do you disseminate or share your results, or is it just through one window or one door through BNPB, or you just do spread it freely to anyone that could access it?
Well, because our or I can say that 95% of the data that we've collected is public information. So we uploaded them all into OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap is an open geospatial data repository that anyone can access, and people can download the data and can analyze it themselves. The other 5% is more on the survey data. That's usually is private level information that usually this is more managed by our partners. But we help them in like on how to collect the data, like how to do data management, data cleaning, and also like for the validation, for the data validation as well.
So what points would be for the 5%? Or like what type of information?
Usually like it's people data, like private, like name, phone number.
That's confidential.
That's confidential. You see like the contact person for the IDP camp, for example. That is something that's not distributed widely. This is more on the contact focal point for the BNPB or BBBs. If they want to distribute logistic, or if they want to check, hey, do you have all of your needs, then they'll make sure that each of these IDP is already receiving logistic as required.
And in regards to usage of this data, which partner uses this data, or from the community or from local NGOs, and in what sense?
So BNPB is primarily our partners in using the data. I mean, even BNPB have their own OpenStreetMap team, which validate and also collect the data on the ground occasionally. This is under Pak Bambang and Pak Marianto.
Yeah.
And they're part of Pastigan, I think.
Yeah.
They're the one who like manage and also collect the data on the ground. So because the goal is to be able to understand like how many buildings and how many kilometers of road in an area, so that they understand if disaster happen, they know that where are these buildings and which road networks got blocked and which road networks that's still open, so that they can use it for logistic distribution. And we also partners with Indonesian Red Cross, for example. Even at several cases, Indonesian Red Cross already have more advanced use of our data. Like they fly their own drones. They have their own imagery, like the aerial imagery, and they upload that into platform called Open Aerial Map, which is also developed by our organization. So they put their drone imagery there, and then later use that for digitize the imagery, so then they understand how many buildings and how many roads networks in the area. But it's very up to date. But usually, like Indonesian Red Cross use this for for village contingency plan. So because Indonesian Red Cross is really have strong networks on the community level, so they have multiple projects in several, like I think it's more than 12. Probably it's like they try to implement this nationally, but more on the village level, about the village level mapping, village level capturing drone imagery, and also like identifying hazard in a village level. They have like a landslide contingency plan for a village in Bengkulu, where we also help in that matter. Like we help them with developing like a village contingency plan. Even like in Bengkulu, one really good positive case is that they printed the map and put it in a billboard in the village office. So then even like the community can see, so this is this is the prone area, the danger zone that they need to prepare. Also, this is the evacuation routes that I need to take if disaster happens. So I think in some of the cases, Indonesian Red Cross is really leading in this sense. But we also work with other organizations such as Karina. Karina is mostly focused on watershed management mapping, which we also help them building the online platform that people can access. And we also use that as an advocacy tools to understand the community condition and also the watershed management, how it was implemented. So there are lots of cases where we work with the local government and local organization and how they can utilize this OpenStreetMap data.
And also in an important step is in the early warning system is the downstream or the capacity to respond to a specific disaster, and what is the community actions. You said previously that your maps have like evacuation routes and where to run to a safe place, and probably where is the spot of the evacuation sites. Did you ever witness people doing the simulation evacuation drills using your maps or something like that?
We're not directly involved in that simulation, but we help them develop the map for that purpose. I mean, even like based on our experience, the best evacuation routes is the one that's developed by the local community, because that's something that cannot be determined by the provincial level or district level government, because local knows best about which road needs to be taken during floods, for example, because they know that you don't take that roads because there will be lots of garbage or there's lots of potholes, so you may get accident if you take that route. And so they're the one who draw that. But
is that captured in the maps that you make? Or
some of the it usually depends on, like with Jakarta case, where we are funded by the Pacific Disaster Center or USA. We capture this evacuation route as well as the IDP. Because in Jakarta, what's interesting is because IDP camp is already determined beforehand. So I mean, even like in several kelurahan or urban village, they already have the focal point and the contact person for each of the IDP camp. And they also have even contingency plan for this IDP camp. Like if the flood is less than 1 meter, we use this IDP camp. But if it's higher than that, we move to another IDP camp. So they have like their own evacuation center that was used depends on the scale of the disaster itself. So yeah.
So how many contingency plan do you have if you have so many villages or
it
urban
depends.
villages?
It depends. I mean, with Jakarta, if I'm not mistaken, they have 126 flood-prone village in Jakarta. But then again, these 126 village have different condition. I mean, not necessarily all the village is have the same. Like one village may be more severe than others. Some airway or sub-village can be really severe, and we help them in mapping the sub-village boundary. So then it helps the local Jakarta Disaster Management Agency on identifying which village need to be focused on more because on the severity of floods, and that they need like boat or they need like more specific case of emergency response tools because they have more severe case of floods.
Kita nunggu selesai itu aja. Okay, so thank you for explaining about your work related to mapping. And I just want to ask, if I say what is the dream early warning system, what do you feel would be the dream or the ideal early warning system in Indonesia?
I think ideally it's not necessarily needs to be like a very advanced in terms of technology, but I think it's more about how you build the early warning system, like how you involve local community, how you also collaborate in developing, because I don't think that there is one single solution that can be applicable throughout the country, but it's more about a single collaborative effort on like building a multi-hazard early warning system. Like if you're talking about landslide, for example, it's good that some of the sensor or for this early warning system is already built in-house or like within our own country. We're not necessarily relying on expensive tools, but I mean that's already like a really good step. It's more about how building awareness, how to build understanding that this is important and it needs to be co-maintained with the local community, because if not, like what happened with the tsunami buoy, that some of them stolen, people sell it, they just won't get like a short monetary value of the buoy because they just, and it's only like a scrap, like the actual price is quite expensive. But if you also involve local community, potentially like this buoy can also guarded by the local community, by the local fishermen, for example, that they know how important that this device in for their own safety, for example. But I think this is I think this is the area that people that we need to improve, that on how we collaborate and how this is not only like a single ministry or a single institution, but this is everyone's effort for a good early warning system. And I think this is much more about the people rather than about the hardware or about the software or like a very intelligent application or something like that.
So what about, how do you feel about the regulatory framework about early warning system? Do you think it's sufficient, or there's still some loopholes in the regulations related to early warning system and involvement of, or regulations to involve the community in the early warning system? How do you feel about that?
I'm not really involved in that sector, so I cannot say much. But from what I understand is that we already have like community-based disaster reduction. I think it will be good if there is some kind of a program or project saying that a community-based early warning system, for example. Like in the past, we have like kantongan system where people just hit kantongan if there is a crisis or if there's something that people need to pay attention on. But now, during the age of gadget, that kind of approach is kind of being left out. People no longer use kantongan. It's hard to find a way to alert people as much people as soon as possible. Like for landslide again, another example is the use of kentongan is really effective in like alerting people in an area, because they know that kentongan is only used in an emergency like fire or like even landslide, so then people can be evacuated quickly. But if you're using smartphone calling people one by one, that's really a slow approach. So we need like understanding what communication, how to disseminate information as quickly as possible. Like we know that now the government also installed tsunami alarm or like tsunami
Sirens.
But what this is also important is also like socialize to people. When you hear the siren, what we need to do. I mean, not necessarily people already aware of that. Like if they heard siren, like I remember that in 2006 in Yogyakarta when there is a big earthquake, initially people think that this is volcanic eruption. So people from the mountain area goes down, going to the beach or like to the low area, coastal area, but then people on the coastal area goes up because they think that there will be tsunami. So I think this is more about, they understand that something needs to be done, or they need to run, but they don't necessarily understand where to run and like what kind of disaster it is. So I think the collaboration or like more dissemination in a local community language is also important to make it effective.
So using the traditional kentongan.
Or even like at some coastal area they also have like rumah panggung or elevated house, because this is also to mitigate, not necessarily it can make them totally safe, but it somehow also mitigate like tidal wave, for example, rather than building a concrete like we saw in tsunami near the Krakatoa, for example, how most of the building in the coastal area is swept by the tsunami, and not necessarily all people more involved or focused on the tourism and building this resort rather than on the mitigation such as bakau, mangrove, like mangrove plantation or something like this. It's not something that's common. Probably it's already common in the past, but because of development, because of the tourism potential, they kind of abandoned that. But that's already there as a part, because local wisdom is already there and saying that hey, we need to have this mangrove. Mangrove is important. Mangrove ecosystem is really important to mitigate the tsunami impact. But people kind of left that out.
And probably the final one, probably about various industries, like you said, the coastal area, the mangroves, and the tourism. What about the farming industry, like the farming, like impacts on floods to farming area, impacts of drought to farming area? Does your maps also highlight those regions, or like for drought, maybe? Not just for the normal seasonal floods, but what about drought? Do you consider like which areas are impacted by the drought, or is it a bit difficult to get the parameters for that?
We're not directly involved with the agriculture in a general sense, but we do involve like in Jakarta and also at other area, particularly Jakarta. In the past 4 to 5 years, we've been involved in the urban farming mapping. Like for example in Marunda in North Jakarta, we collaborate in a project called Muria, Marunda Urban Resilience in Action, that basically try to map the urban farming effort done by the local community. Initially these local communities did not even exist on the map, because like the current commercial map didn't really focus on community-based area or like kampung or like village. But then when they put on the map and we see that there are so many activities related to urban farming, this is also like really important in building their own like resilient for flood, for example. If they cannot access the market or they don't have money because it's already spent on flood mitigation, then they can still have like good nutrition by owning their own urban farming. This approach is then also adapted by the Office of Fishery Farming, Fishery, Agriculture and Food Resilience in Jakarta.
In Jakarta,
DKPKP.
Yeah.
They also use our platform to monitor all the urban farming activities all over Jakarta. Not only in Marunda, North Jakarta, but also like for South Jakarta and for other part of Jakarta. So they want to capture what's a good practice have been implemented by the community, such as green alley or gang hijau. Basically, they try to use vacant spot in a kampung or like in an urban village, and then they plant vegetables and also plant like medicine herbs. So then the local community can use that rather than relying on traditional markets.
Okay, thank you very much for the time. It's already one hour within the interview. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.